October 31st, 1981. The village of Godric's Hollow lay silent beneath a bruised autumn sky, the last embers of Halloween fading as families tucked their children into warm beds. Across Britain, wizards and witches had no idea that the world was about to crack open. That Voldemort, the Dark Lord who had terrorized the magical world for over a decade, had finally met the one being capable of undoing him. What they did not know, and what history would spend decades untangling, was that the aftermath of that night would hinge not just on a curse rebounding from a baby's forehead, but on who arrived first at the smouldering ruins of a cottage in Godric's Hollow. Sirius Black came first, or nearly, but it was not Sirius Black who found the child alive in the wreckage. It was Lucius Malfoy. This is the detail that changes everything. Lucius had ridden the tide of Voldemort's fall differently than many Death Eaters. Already a master of political survival, already distancing himself in those final months, he had nonetheless felt the pull of obligation, or perhaps morbid curiosity, to visit the scene of his master's destruction. He had apparated to the outskirts of Godric's Hollow with the silent, practiced ease of a man who had been performing clandestine visits for years. He expected ruins. He expected corpses, perhaps too, and the hollow satisfaction of knowing the Dark Lord's business was concluded. What he found, instead, was a baby with green eyes, sitting in the wreckage, very much alive, with a lightning bolt scar burning crimson on his forehead. The child, Harry James Potter, 1 year old, son of James and Lily Potter, looked up at Lucius Malfoy without fear. He did not cry. He simply stared, with eyes so impossibly green they seemed to hold their own light, and reached out one small hand toward the man looming over him in black robes. Lucius stood there for a long moment. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to leave. Walk away. Let someone else find the boy. Let Dumbledore's people take him. Let the ministry sort out the mess. Let the boy who lived become someone else's complication. Lucius Malfoy had not survived this long by making reckless decisions. And yet, the child was the son of a blood traitor and a muggle-born. He was everything Lucius had been taught to despise. He was also, undeniably, the most powerful magical accident in living memory. A 1-year-old who had survived the killing curse, who bore the mark of that survival on his face like a brand. Lucius Malfoy was many things, but he was never a fool. He understood power. He understood what this child represented. And he understood, with the cold clarity that had always defined him, that leaving Harry Potter in the ruins of Godric's Hollow was a waste of something extraordinary. He picked the child up. Narcissa's reaction, 2 hours later in the drawing room of Malfoy Manor, was not what Lucius expected. She did not rage. She did not demand he return the child immediately. She looked at the small, dark-haired boy in her husband's arms, studied the scar on his forehead, and then looked at Lucius with an expression he had only seen on her face once before. The day she had first held Draco. "What is his name?" she asked quietly. "Harry," Lucius said. "Harry Potter." Narcissa reached out and took the child from him. Harry went to her without protest, his green eyes studying her face with that same unnerving, ancient calm. Narcissa held him for a long moment, then looked back at her husband. "We will need a story," she said. Hash, hash, the architecture of a lie. The story they constructed was elegant in its simplicity. Lucius, they told the ministry, had found the child during what he claimed was a routine post-battle inspection. A civic duty, he called it, though no one had asked him to perform it. He had taken the boy to prevent him from being left exposed to the elements. He had, of course, intended to turn the child over to the proper authorities immediately. But then Narcissa had become attached, and Lucius Malfoy, whatever his public reputation, was not a man who denied his wife the things she wanted. It was a lie that worked precisely because it was wrapped around a truth. Narcissa had become attached. Within 48 hours of Harry's arrival at Malfoy Manor, she had made it plain to her husband that she intended to keep the boy, not as a ward, not as a political convenience, but as a second son. Dumbledore protested. Of course he did. Albus Dumbledore arrived at Malfoy Manor 2 days after Halloween with Minerva McGonagall at his side and the full weight of his moral authority bearing down on him like a weather system. He informed Lucius and Narcissa in calm but absolute terms that Harry Potter needed to be placed with his mother's sister, his only remaining blood relative, in order to activate an ancient protection rooted in Lily Potter's sacrifice. Lucius listened to all of this with great patience, then pointed out in equally calm terms that Lily Potter was a Muggle-born and that Petunia Dursley was a Muggle with no magical ability whatsoever, and that placing the most famous child in the wizarding world with Muggles in a non-magical household in what Lucius understood to be a suburb of Surrey struck him as an extraordinarily poor plan. The blood protection, Dumbledore began, is theoretical, Lucius said, and I have a team of curse breakers and ward specialists who will have equivalent protections installed on this property within a fortnight. The boy will be safe here, Albus, arguably safer than anywhere else in Britain. What followed was a negotiation that lasted 3 weeks and involved at various points the full Wizengamot, 2 ministers for magic, and a written deposition from Augusta Longbottom. In the end, Lucius won. He had the resources, the political connections, and the legal team. Dumbledore had the moral high ground, but moral high ground had never stopped Lucius Malfoy from doing anything. Harry Potter remained at Malfoy Manor, the official designation, hammered out by lawyers on both sides, was wardship with full parental authority. Harry would retain the Potter name. He would retain access to the Potter family vaults when he came of age. He would be known, publicly, as Harry Potter Malfoy, a hyphenation that Lucius found mildly distasteful, but Narcissa insisted upon, arguing that it preserved the boy's heritage. He would be raised as a Malfoy in all practical senses, while remaining legally Harry Potter. Dumbledore accepted this arrangement with the quiet, heavy grace of a man who knows he has lost a battle, but intends to keep watching the war. Before he left Malfoy Manor for the last time that autumn, he paused in the entrance hall and looked back at Narcissa, who was holding Harry against her shoulder. "He is going to be a remarkable young man," Dumbledore said, "whatever path he walks." Yes, Narcissa agreed, he is. Growing up in the manor, Malfoy Manor was not a warm place. It had not been designed for warmth. It had been designed for intimidation, for display, for the projection of ancient power and unassailable status. Its corridors were long and cold, its portraits watchful, its rooms furnished with the kind of antique grandeur that made small children feel like intruders in a museum. It was, in almost every measurable way, the wrong environment in which to raise a child who would one day need to be brave, humble, and kind. And yet, for Harry Potter Malfoy, it was home. He grew up in those cold corridors and became, somehow, at ease in them. By the time he was 3, he knew every portrait by name and could tell you which ones would speak back and which ones merely watched. By 5, he was scaling the grand staircase banisters with a fearlessness that sent the household elves into quiet fits of anxiety. By 7, he had claimed a window seat in the East Library as his particular territory and spent whole afternoons there, reading the kind of books that most wizarding children would not encounter until their 3rd year at Hogwarts. He was not the same child he would have been. How could he be? The years with the Dursleys, the cupboard under the stairs, the casual cruelties, the deliberate suppression of his magical identity. None of that happened. Harry Potter Malfoy grew up knowing exactly who and what he was. He grew up with servants and space, with a library full of dark history and defensive magic theory, with a mother who loved him fiercely and a father who regarded him with the complicated, guarded respect one might give to a very clever and unpredictable animal. Narcissa was the defining force of his early childhood. She was the one who read to him at night, who taught him the names of the stars from the Black family tradition, who sat beside him in the East Library and answered his questions with the same patience and precision she brought to everything she did. She was not a soft woman. Narcissa Malfoy had never been soft, but she was loving, in the particular Malfoy way that expressed itself through attention and investment rather than open warmth. She noticed everything about Harry. She remembered everything he told her. She took him seriously in the way that adults rarely take small children seriously, which meant that Harry grew up believing, at a bone-deep level, that what he thought and felt and wanted mattered. This would prove both his greatest strength and, in certain moments, his most complicated inheritance. Draco was 2 months younger than Harry and had the natural resentment of a child who had been an only child until he wasn't. The first year was difficult. Draco did not understand why there was suddenly another boy in his house, sleeping down the hall, sitting at his breakfast table, being held by his mother. He expressed this confusion in the only way available to a 14-month-old, loudly and often. But children are adaptive creatures, and Draco Malfoy, for all the arrogance that would later define him, was not without intelligence or feeling. By the time both boys were 3, they had settled into a relationship that was less brotherhood than alliance, competitive, occasionally combative, but fundamentally loyal in the way that only children who grow up together can be. They quarreled constantly and viciously over small things. Who got the better broom at Christmas? Whose magical accidents were more impressive? Who Narcissa loved more? But they also, quietly and without ceremony, had each other's backs. When a visiting pureblood family's son made the mistake of calling Harry a half-blood orphan at a summer gathering, Draco hexed him without hesitation. His first successful offensive spell, performed at age 6, entirely in defense of the boy he spent most of his time fighting with. Lucius watched both children with the calculating eye of a man running a long game. He had not been wrong about Harry's significance. Even in early childhood, the boy's magic was extraordinary. Raw and uncontrolled, and occasionally alarming, the kind of magical force that bent the air in a room. By age 8, Harry had accidentally transfigured a bookshelf into a staircase, summoned a thunderstorm over the manor's east wing, and on one memorable occasion caused every mirror in the house to show a different reflection than the person standing before it. The manor's portraits talked about that last incident for months. Lucius began Harry's formal education at age 7, earlier than was typical, but Lucius Malfoy did not believe in waiting for institutions to do what he could do himself. He taught both boys together history of the great wizarding families, the theory of magic, the politics of the wizarding world, the intricate social architecture of pureblood society. Harry absorbed all of it with the same focused, slightly unnerving attention he gave to everything. He asked questions that Lucius didn't always want to answer. Questions about blood status, about the war, about the Dark Lord, about what Lucius himself had done during those years. The questions were precise and showed a mind already capable of finding the gaps in a carefully constructed narrative. Lucius answered some of them. He deflected others. He filed away, privately, the knowledge that Harry Potter Malfoy was going to be very difficult to manage once he got to Hogwarts. Hash hash. The weight of a name. Harry was 8 years old the first time he fully understood who he was to the wider wizarding world. It happened at Diagon Alley during a back-to-school shopping trip that Narcissa had allowed to become a social occasion, a mistake she would not repeat. They had barely stepped out of Gringotts when the whispers started. Is that him? Is that the Potter boy? The one who survived you-know-who? Harry heard it all with perfect clarity. He had always had exceptional hearing, another magical quirk that the Manor's elves had learned to account for. He heard the whispers and he stopped walking, and Narcissa felt his hand tighten in hers and looked down to find him staring at a cluster of witches who were openly pointing. "They're talking about me," Harry said. It was not a question. "Yes," Narcissa said. She did not soften it or dress it up. That was not her way. "Because of you-know-who." Because of what happened when you were 1 year old. Because of the scar. She paused. Because your parents died, and you survived something that no one else has ever survived, and people find that both frightening and wonderful. Harry was quiet for a moment, processing this with the focused intensity he brought to everything. Then, do they know I live with you? Yes. Do they think that's strange? Narcissa looked down at him and felt, for a moment, the full complicated weight of the choice she and Lucius had made 7 years ago. Some of them do, she said honestly. You are allowed to think it's strange too, if you wish. Harry considered the cluster of witches still watching him from across the alley. Then he squared his shoulders, a gesture so perfectly Malfoy that Narcissa felt a sudden fierce pride and looked back at her. I don't think it's strange, he said. It's just home. But the encounter planted something, Harry began, that year to ask more pointed questions about his biological parents. Narcissa answered them carefully and completely. She had always believed that he deserved the truth, and that a truth discovered on one's own terms was infinitely better than a truth stumbled into. She told him about James Potter, brave, arrogant, a gifted Quidditch player, fiercely loyal. She told him about Lily Evans Potter, brilliant, muggle-born, one of the most talented witches of her generation, a woman who had loved her son so completely that the love itself had become a weapon against the darkest magic in existence. She did not tell him everything she knew about what Lucius had been in those years. That was a conversation for later. But she did not lie to him either, and Harry, who could detect a lie with the same instinctive accuracy with which he detected approaching weather, understood that there were things she was choosing not to say yet, and filed this information away for future use. He wrote to Sirius Black that year. This was by any measure the most significant thing Harry did in his pre-Hogwarts life. Sirius Black had not gone to Azkaban in this timeline. With Dumbledore watching the case closely and Harry's wardship in legal dispute, the Ministry had been forced to actually conduct a proper trial. At which point, it emerged that Peter Pettigrew was in fact alive and in hiding, and that Sirius had never been the secret keeper. Sirius had been acquitted, had spent a year recovering from the ordeal, and had settled into a kind of watchful orbit around the situation at Malfoy Manor, too proud to beg access to his godson, too bound by love to stay entirely away. The letter was short. Harry's letters were always short. He had learned compression from Lucius, who believed that a man who used more words than necessary was advertising his uncertainty. It said, I know you're my godfather. Mother showed me the photo. I thought you might like to know I'm well. Harry P.M. Sirius Black, reading this letter in the kitchen of Grimold Place, wept for the first time since the night he'd lost everything. September 1st, 1991. King's Cross Station, Platform 9 3/4. Harry Potter Malfoy stepped through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, with the practiced ease of someone who had been told exactly what to expect, and had mentally rehearsed it 14 times. He was 11 years old, dark-haired, green-eyed, dressed in robes that had been tailored by the same Diagon Alley shop that dressed the entire Malfoy family, carrying a trunk that Narcissa had packed with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything. Beside him, Draco was already scanning the platform with the imperious satisfaction of someone arriving somewhere they consider their rightful domain. The whispers started within 30 seconds. Harry had grown accustomed to the whispers. He did not flinch from them anymore, had not flinched since that day in Diagon Alley 3 years ago. He let them roll over him the way the manor let weather roll over its stones, acknowledging the force without being moved by it. He was aware of the stares, the pointed fingers, the parents pulling their children close to whisper, "That's him. That's the Potter boy, the one who survived." He was aware, too, of the more complicated looks from people who knew where he had been raised. The narrowed eyes, the tightened mouths, the silent calculations. He did not particularly care about any of it. What he cared about in that moment was the train. He had read about the Hogwarts Express, of course, had read about it in 3 separate books, and heard Lucius describe it with the dismissive fondness of a man who considers nostalgia a mild weakness he permits himself. But reading and hearing were not the same as standing on the platform with steam billowing around his ankles and the scarlet engine stretching out before him like a promise made physical. Harry stood still for just a moment, one of the few times in his life he allowed himself to simply feel something before analyzing it, and let the sight settle into him. Then Draco said, "Stop standing there looking like you've seen a vision," and Harry picked up his trunk and followed him onto the train. They found a compartment easily. No one challenged a Malfoy for a compartment. Harry stowed his trunk, settled into the seat by the window, and opened a book. A history of Hogwarts that he had already read twice, but found useful to have in hand as a conversation stopper. Draco sat across from him and immediately began holding court for the parade of pureblood children who came to pay their respects, which was what these visits essentially were. Social acknowledgement of the Malfoy family's standing, performed in miniature by 11-year-olds in new robes. Crabbe and Goyle arrived and settled into their customary positions, flanking Draco with the reliable dullness Harry had always found mildly exhausting. Pansy Parkinson arrived and kissed Draco on the cheek and looked at Harry with the guarded interest she had always shown him, a mixture of calculation and genuine curiosity that he respected more than open admiration. Theodore Nott arrived, said very little, and sat in the corner reading, which Harry approved of. Then the compartment door slid open, and a boy with red hair and a smudge of dirt on his nose looked in. He was clearly a Weasley. Harry had seen the Weasley family at enough public events to recognize the hair and the freckles. This particular Weasley looked at the assembled group with an expression caught between social uncertainty and stubborn pride, and then his eyes found Harry, and the uncertainty collapsed into something else entirely. "Is it true?" the boy said. "Are you really Harry Potter?" Draco made a sound of profound disdain. Harry lowered his book. "Harry Potter Malfoy," Harry said. "Yes." The Weasley boy, Ron, Harry would learn. Ronald Bilius Weasley, sixth child of Arthur and Molly, stared at him with an expression Harry recognized from long experience. The look of someone encountering something they had built up extensively in their imagination, and finding that reality is not quite what they expected. Harry was familiar with this look. He had been causing it since he was 8 years old. "Oh," Ron said. Then, with the blunt honesty that Harry would come to understand was simply Ron Weasley's primary mode of communication, "I didn't know you lived with the Malfoys." "Most people do," Harry said. "It's been in the papers. We don't really read those papers," Ron said, in a tone that suggested the Weasley household had strong opinions about which papers were worth reading. His eyes moved to Draco, and some silent, ancient Weasley Malfoy hostility flickered to life in his expression. "Weasley," Draco said, with the specific inflection he used when he wanted to convey an entire social history in a single word. "Malfoy," Ron said back, with a different but equally loaded inflection. Harry looked between them, with the mild interest of a naturalist observing a familiar territorial display. "Was there something you wanted?" he asked Ron, not unkindly. Ron looked back at him. There was a beat of silence in which Ron Weasley appeared to conduct some internal negotiation. Then, "No, just wanted to see." A pause. "Your scar. Sorry. That's rude, isn't it?" Mildly. Harry agreed. But something about the bluntness of it, the honest rudeness of it, so different from the careful, calculated social performances he had grown up watching, made him almost smile. "There's a free compartment, 2 doors down, if you're looking." Ron nodded once, gave Draco one last look of pure ancestral suspicion, and left. The door slid closed. "Weasleys," Draco said, with feeling. Said Harry, and went back to his book. He thought about Ron Weasley for the rest of the train journey, in the background of his mind where he kept things that hadn't resolved yet. The sorting was everything the books had led him to expect, and nothing like what he had imagined. The great hall was larger than any room in Malfoy Manor, which was itself not a small place, and the enchanted ceiling was throwing a perfect replica of a cloudy autumn night across the vaulted space above 400 students. Harry walked in with the other first years and kept his expression neutral and his chin up, which were the two things Lucius had specifically instructed him to do at every public event ever, and felt the weight of collective attention fall on him like a physical thing the moment McGonagall read his name. Potter Malfoy, Harry. The hall did not quite go silent, but it went something close to it, a collective intake of breath, a sudden drop in the ambient noise that was more eloquent than actual silence. Harry walked to the stool, sat down, and allowed the sorting hat to be placed on his head. What happened next was, Harry would later reflect, the most privately significant conversation of his Hogwarts career, and no one else in the hall heard a word of it. "Interesting," said the hat, in the particular tone of a very old intelligence encountering something genuinely novel. "Very interesting indeed. I haven't seen a mind quite like this in, well, let me look." Harry sat still and let it look. He had always found invasion of privacy less upsetting than most people did. Possibly because he had grown up in a house where Lucius Malfoy noticed everything, and privacy was a matter of what you chose not to reveal, rather than what others could not see. "You could be great, you know," the hat said. "There's talent here, remarkable talent, and a hunger to prove yourself. I see it clearly. Slytherin would help you on your way to greatness, no doubt about that. It's where your family expects you, where the path of least resistance leads." "I know," Harry thought back. "But—" "I didn't say but." "You were thinking it," the hat said, with something that might have been amusement. "There is something in you that does not want the path of least resistance, something that has been watching, waiting, measuring everything it was taught against some internal standard of its own, a mind that was given the Malfoy worldview and spent 10 years quietly testing it." Harry said nothing. This was accurate enough to be uncomfortable. "Gryffindor would be the obvious rebellion," the hat continued. "And you are, whatever your upbringing, your father's son in one specific way. You do not do things for symbolic effect. You do things because they are strategically correct." Gryffindor would make a statement. "Ravenclaw would suit your mind. Hufflepuff would suit a part of your character that has been somewhat suppressed by your environment, but is genuinely present. And Slytherin said the hat would give you the tools to do what I believe you are eventually going to try to do, which is change things from the inside. And that, young Harry, is the most Slytherin ambition I have encountered in quite some time." There was a pause. "Slytherin," the hat announced to the hall. The Slytherin table erupted. Harry removed the hat, handed it back to McGonagall, who was watching him with an expression of carefully composed neutrality that he recognized as concealing strong feeling, and walked to his new table. Draco grabbed his arm the moment he sat down, gripped tight with genuine relief, and said, quietly and with more feeling than he usually permitted himself, "Good." Harry sat down in the green and silver of Slytherin, watched the rest of the sorting with his usual focused attention, and noted, with interest, that Ron Weasley went to Gryffindor, and that a girl named Hermione Granger, whose hand had been up before McGonagall had even finished saying her name, went to Gryffindor too. He filed both names away. Hash hash the education of Harry Potter. Malfoy. Hogwarts was, Harry decided within the first week, the most interesting place he had ever been. This was saying something, given that he had grown up in a house with centuries of magical history embedded in its very stones. But Malfoy Manor, for all its power, was a single family's accumulated knowledge. Hogwarts was something else, a living institution that had been absorbing the magic and history and conflict of the wizarding world for 1,000 years, and you could feel it in the corridors, in the shifting staircases, in the portraits that offered unsolicited opinions. in the way the castle itself seemed to respond to the moods of the people inside it. Harry threw himself into his studies with an intensity that surprised even his Slytherin housemates, who were not, as a group, opposed to academic ambition. He had arrived better prepared than almost anyone in his year. Lucius's private tutoring, combined with his own extensive reading in the Manor library, meant that very little in the first-year curriculum was genuinely new to him. What was new was the practice. Theory had always come easily. The physical reality of making a wand produce consistent, directed magic was a different matter, and Harry attacked it with the same systematic thoroughness he applied to everything. He was good. He was, in fact, very good. Better than Draco, who had always considered himself the more naturally gifted of the two, and whose response to this discovery was a period of approximately 3 weeks of strained civility before he recalibrated and decided that competing with Harry academically was a game he would lose, and redirected his competitive energies toward Quidditch. The only person in Harry's year who rivaled him academically was Hermione Granger, and their relationship was one of the more interesting dynamics of his first year. They had no natural social pathway to each other. She was Gryffindor, he was Slytherin, and the house rivalry was real and persistent enough to make casual friendship genuinely difficult. But they kept encountering each other in the library, drawn by the same instinct to seek out the most obscure and demanding texts on whatever they were currently studying. And after the third time, they found themselves reaching for the same book. They arrived at an unspoken arrangement. They would share resources, compare notes across house lines, and maintain a careful mutual respect that neither of them called friendship, because neither of them was quite ready for that word. It was Hermione who, in early November of first year, said something that Harry turned over in his mind for months afterward. They were sitting on opposite sides of a library table, working through the same transfiguration problem from different angles, when she looked up from her book and said, with the blunt precision that was her dominant mode, "You know everything you were taught at home isn't true, don't you?" Harry looked at her over the top of his book. "Which part?" "The blood status part," she said, without flinching. "The part where some people are worth less because of their parentage." "My mother was a Muggle-born," Harry said. "I'm aware the logic has problems." Hermione studied him with those sharp, assessing eyes. "But you still live there. You still sit at their table." "Where else would I sit?" Harry said, and meant it as more than a rhetorical question. He meant, "I grew up there. Those are the people I know. Knowing something is imperfect is not the same as having somewhere better to go." He meant, "I am still figuring out what I actually believe, and I would appreciate you not requiring me to have finished that process by age 11. Hermione, who was perceptive enough to hear some of this subtext, was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to her book. But something had been named between them that couldn't be unnamed, and Harry found it sitting with him in a new way. The question of where exactly he stood, and whether the education he'd received at Malfoy Manor was something to build on, or something to dismantle. He did not tell Draco about these conversations. Draco would not have understood them. He did tell Sirius, in letters that had become, by this point, a regular correspondence that meant more to both of them than either quite admitted. Sirius's letters back were long, vivid, full of stories about James Potter, the real James, not the sanitized version, but the complicated, brilliant, difficult man who had been Harry's father. Sirius did not hide the fact that he had despised Lucius Malfoy for most of his adult life. He also did not hide the fact that he was glad Harry had not ended up in Surrey. "Your mum would have wanted you to ask exactly the questions you're asking," Sirius wrote, in a letter Harry kept and reread. "She was the best person I ever knew at holding two true things at once, loving people who were flawed and still believing in something better. You're more like her than you know." Hash, hash, Quirrell, the stone, and the first real test. The business with the Philosopher's Stone in first year unfolded differently when Harry was a Slytherin raised by Lucius Malfoy. Some things were the same. Professor Quirrell was still possessed by the remnant of Voldemort, still after the stone, still a danger lurking behind a nervous stammer and a purple turban. The three-headed dog was still on the third floor. The protections were still in place. But Harry's approach to the problem was fundamentally different. He did not stumble onto the mystery by accident. He investigated it deliberately, methodically, in the way that Lucius had taught him to approach any situation involving hidden power. Gather information first, identify the actors, map the motivations, and only then decide on a course of action. He noticed Quirrell's behavior in September, filed it away. He noticed the attempted break-in at Gringotts, cross-referenced it with what he knew about Flamel and the stone from the Manor Library, and had a working theory by mid-October. He did not, crucially, try to handle it alone. He went to Snape first. This was the decision that changed the shape of the year. Severus Snape, potions master and head of Slytherin, had treated Harry with a complicated neutrality since September. The neutrality of a man who has strong feelings about a student and has decided, for complex private reasons, to keep those feelings entirely to himself. When Harry arrived at his office in late October and laid out a precise, evidence-based case that a member of the Hogwarts staff was likely being used as a vessel by the remnant of Lord Voldemort, Snape sat very still for a very long time. Then he said, "Who else have you told?" "No one." Harry said, "Not Draco?" "No." Snape looked at him with an expression Harry couldn't fully read. Something between respect and a sadness so old it had become structural, part of the architecture of the man's face. "You have your mother's instincts," Snape said, very quietly, and Harry filed this away with everything else he was collecting about Lily Potter. What followed was handled quietly, efficiently, and without the dramatic confrontation that might otherwise have occurred. Snape took the information to Dumbledore. Dumbledore made arrangements. Quirrell was removed from Hogwarts in early spring under circumstances the student body was told were health-related. The stone was protected, then ultimately destroyed. Voldemort's remnant, denied a host and a path to embodiment, dissipated further. The year ended without a confrontation in the dungeons, without Harry nearly dying, without the full dramatic arc of a quest completed by three children acting against the direct instructions of every adult in the building. Harry sat in the year-end feast and felt, alongside the satisfaction of a problem solved, a strange hollow sense that something was missing. That the year had been a test he had passed in the wrong way, too sensibly, too safely, without learning something he couldn't yet name. He mentioned this to Sirius, who wrote back, "That feeling is your Gryffindor blood objecting to excessive Slytherin pragmatism. Don't worry. There will be other chances to do something genuinely stupid and brave. I promise." Hash hash. The growing fracture. Second year brought the Chamber of Secrets and a crisis that hit closer to home than anything before it. Students petrified. The message on the wall. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the heir, beware. And underneath it, Mrs. Norris, stiff and staring. The whispers started immediately. The heir of Slytherin is back. Harry knew, by October of second year, that the diary was the key. He had seen Draco given it, had watched Lucius press it into Ginny Weasley's cauldron in Diagon Alley with a smile so controlled it was essentially a threat, and had filed the moment away with the cold. Specific attention he gave to things that felt wrong. He had not known then what the diary was. He began to understand in November, when the petrification started, and he recognized the pattern from the historical accounts he'd read of the last time the chamber had opened, 50 years ago. He was also, by this point, hearing a voice in the walls, a cold, sliding voice that no one else seemed to hear, which Harry recognized from his reading as Parseltongue, the language of serpents. A gift, strongly associated with Salazar Slytherin and not coincidentally with the Dark Lord who had killed his parents. Harry was a Parselmouth. He had discovered this at age 9. in the manor's garden, and had told no one except Narcissa, who had received the information with equanimity, and immediately found him 3 books on the history and theory of Parseltongue ability. He had not told Lucius, instinctively certain that Lucius would find some way to use it. He told Hermione about the diary. He did not explain the Parselmouth part, but he gave her the information she needed to research, and Hermione Granger given a research task was more dangerous than most wizards given a wand. She came back to him in 3 days with a relevant history, the account of Moaning Myrtle's death 50 years ago, and a theory about the monster in the chamber. A basilisk, she said. It has to be. Moved through the pipes, Harry agreed, which is why no one can track it. The voice you're hearing, you're not going to tell me what it is, are you? Harry looked at her. Not yet. Hermione admirably accepted this. She had learned, over a year of careful alliance with Harry Potter Malfoy, that not yet was different from no, and that pushing on not yet produced nothing useful. The confrontation with the memory of Tom Riddle happened differently in this version of events. Harry did not stumble into it. He went in deliberately, alone, after working out the location of the chamber entrance from Myrtle's bathroom and the sound of the pipes. He went without telling Draco, without telling Snape, which was a departure from his usual method and one he examined honestly. He went alone because he understood, on some level, that what lived in that chamber was connected to him in a way that was personal, that this was a conversation between 2 people who shared something, and the nature of that something needed to be settled privately first. Tom Riddle's memory was everything Harry had expected, and nothing he'd prepared himself for. Beautiful, plausible, utterly persuasive, a version of himself that had made different choices, or rather, had been made by different circumstances, into something with no choices left at all. Riddle tried the obvious approach first. We are the same, you and I, both orphans, both parcel-mouths, both children that the wizarding world would have set aside. Harry let him talk. He was good at letting people talk. Lucius had taught him that too, that the person who speaks first reveals most. You're a memory, Harry said, when Riddle had finished. A piece of a soul stored in a diary, which means whatever you tell me about yourself, you're telling me what Tom Riddle believed about Tom Riddle at 16. And 16-year-old boys, Harry added, are often wrong about the most important things. Riddle's eyes went cold. Ginny slumped against the chamber wall, stirred slightly as her energy began to return. The basilisk was the hard part. Harry could speak to it. That was, he discovered, a genuinely useful ability when the creature in question was receiving orders from someone who also spoke Parseltongue. He couldn't override Riddle's control entirely, but he could complicate it. He spoke to the basilisk in the language it understood, told it that the one commanding it was a memory, a ghost, a fragment, not a true speaker, and the basilisk, ancient and not unintelligent, hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Fawkes arrived, Dumbledore's phoenix loyal to the school and its headmaster in ways that transcended ordinary animal bonds, and the basilisk's eyes were dealt with. The rest was harder and more painful than Harry let on afterward, but it was done. He emerged from the chamber with Ginny Weasley conscious and walking under her own power. His robes destroyed and his arm badly lacerated, and found Dumbledore and a very pale Ron Weasley waiting at the top of the shaft. Ron looked at him with an expression Harry had not previously received from a Weasley, something beyond suspicion or curiosity, something closer to raw, undefended gratitude. You saved her, Ron said. You saved my sister. Yes, Harry said. A beat of silence. Then, why? Harry considered this question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. Because she needed saving, he said finally. That seemed sufficient reason. Ron Weasley was quiet for a moment. Then he said with the abrupt, declarative certainty that was his particular gift, You're not like I thought you'd be. No, Harry agreed. Most people aren't. Lucius's reckoning. The aftermath of the chamber was where the fracture between Harry and Lucius became, for the first time, visible. Harry knew. He had known since Diagon Alley, since he had watched Lucius slip the diary into Ginny Weasley's cauldron with that cold, controlled smile. He had spent the intervening months confirming it, building the case, with the same methodical patience that he brought to all his investigations, and by the time he emerged from the chamber, he had no remaining doubt. Lucius Malfoy had deliberately introduced a piece of Voldemort's soul into Hogwarts, targeted specifically at the most accessible and vulnerable child available, as a scheme to both discredit Arthur Weasley and, Harry was fairly certain, test whether the Dark Lord's legacy could be revived. Harry sat across from Lucius in the Manor's study the first evening of summer and told him what he knew. He laid it out with the precise, evidence-based delivery Lucius himself had taught him. He did not rage. He did not accuse. He stated facts, in order, with their supporting evidence, and watched Lucius's face go through the subtle recalibrations of a man who has been outmaneuvered and is calculating responses in real time. When Harry finished, there was a long silence. "You went into the chamber alone," Lucius said. "Not a denial, a deflection." "Yes, that was unnecessarily dangerous. I know. You could have been killed. I'm aware." Another silence. Lucius looked at Harry, really looked at him, in the way he rarely permitted himself. And Harry looked back, and something passed between them that was more honest than most conversations they had ever had. "The girl was not meant to be harmed," Lucius said finally. It was not quite an apology. It was not quite a justification. It was a man who had spent 20 years being absolutely certain about his own worldview, encountering the specific discomfort of someone he cared about, looking at the consequences of that worldview, and finding them wanting. "She almost died," Harry said. "Yes, a 12-year-old girl almost died in the Chamber of Secrets because of a decision you made." Lucius said nothing. "I need you to understand," Harry said, and his voice was very quiet and very steady, "that I will not pretend otherwise. I will not forget it happened. You are my father in the way that matters. You are the person who raised me, who taught me, who shaped the way I think, and I love you in whatever way I am capable of loving. And none of that changes the fact that what you did was wrong, and that you know it was wrong, and that the knowing is going to cost you something eventually." Lucius looked at him for a very long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Your mother would have said something very similar. Your biological mother, Lily." Harry stood up. "I know," he said. "Snape told me." He left Lucius sitting alone in the study and went to find Narcissa. The turning third year brought Sirius Black to Hogwarts, or rather, brought the version of Sirius Black that the wizarding world believed in. The escaped prisoner, the betrayer, the dangerous man who had sold the Potters to their deaths. The fact that none of this was true was known to Harry, to Dumbledore, and to a handful of others, but the rest of the world operated on the false version, and the false version had escaped from Azkaban and was apparently heading for Hogwarts. Harry found this situation less alarming than most, primarily because he had been corresponding with Sirius for 2 years and knew exactly what his godfather was. He also had a reasonably good theory, by mid-October, about where Sirius was hiding and what he was actually after. The new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher was one Remus Lupin, who arrived in September looking like a man who hadn't slept properly in a decade, and who turned out to be the best defense teacher Hogwarts had seen in years. Harry liked him immediately. There was a specific quality to Lupin's attention, a combination of intellectual rigor and genuine care for his students. That Harry recognized as the mark of someone who had suffered significantly and come through it without becoming cruel. He recognized it partly because he saw some version of it in Sirius's letters. He also recognized in October that Lupin was a werewolf. The signs were in the calendar, in the absences, in the particular quality of the exhaustion that visited Lupin at monthly intervals. Harry did not consider this especially alarming. The Manor Library had extensive material on lycanthropy, and Harry's relationship with information was that knowledge reduced threat rather than creating it. He did not tell Draco, who would have made it political. He did not tell Snape, who already knew and whose feelings about Lupin were a complex and badly buried thing that Harry had been mapping with care since first year.